4 women have alleged Brand assaulted them between 2006 and 2013 when he was at the height of his fame. He was presenting on BBC Radio and on Channel 4 before moving to Hollywood to star in films. Let's hear a clip from Channel 4's Dispatches programme, Russell Brand in Plain Sight.
I was pushing him away, and he wasn't backing off at all. And so I ended up having to punch him really hard in the stomach to get him off. And then he fell backwards, and I was crying, and he said, "Oh, I only want to see your mascara run anyway."
Brand denies the allegations and says that his relationships have been always consensual.
When the rumours started to surface just before the weekend that Channel 4 were going to broadcast a potentially career-ending expose, people were saying it must be a comedian. You're obviously a comedian. Did you know who it would be?
Yes. This is a well-known open secret from the comedy circuit.
Right.
It's been something that's been talked about, certainly to my knowledge, for at least the last 5 years. It's something that's been pretty openly discussed in the comedy industry. I think I remember first hearing about it kind of in mid sort of 2017. Subsequent to Dispatches and the Sunday Times expose, Deadline ran a story about an incident that happened on a TV show called Roast Battle where jokes were made referencing Brand being an abuser, and they were removed from the broadcast. That obviously happened on a studio floor. So from that point onwards, it was common knowledge within comedy that there were several allegations about Russell Brand, and specifically relating to sexual assault. So from that point onwards, it was well known. It was discussed by multiple comedians in Edinburgh Fringe shows the following year in 2018. Like it was that well known.
But when you say it was well known, like what was known? Like, is it, because I think that's something that, you know, in the documentary, they talk about this idea in that is in plain sight. You know that it's on the line, but you don't actually know that it's crossed it.
Well, look, to be completely honest with you, the story that I had heard was relating to a sexual assault. It was not covered in the documentary.
Right.
So it was a very specific and serious allegation. I was not aware of any of the stories in the documentary. I was surprised watching it how far back this had gone. Those weren't stories that I'd actually heard about. So it is possible that there's more allegations to come. And I think this is a real moment for everybody to consider how this was allowed to happen and how this was allowed to go on for so long and what are the systemic and institutional failings. And I think if you look at Russell Brand's IMDb page, you see that his television work in Britain starts to dry up around 2018, 2019. And that's simply because increasingly people were just not willing to work with him. Everyone was afraid to talk about it because of the threat of lawsuits, you know. And so the only power people had was to withdraw participation from shows involving Russell Brand. And that goes for everybody. That goes for comedians, that goes for people that work in production. And you can see from his IMDb page that he starts to increasingly only work in America and work on his own podcast channel and YouTube channel. And that is an example of, I think, a systemic failing. You know, watching it as a male comedian, cisgendered, heterosexual male comedian, you feel a certain sense of guilt and a certain sense of complicity because you've been working with production companies and producers who are providing an infrastructure that allows predators to thrive. I've been reading a lot and been following a lot of how the story's been covered. And there is this tendency, which I think is not an incorrect impulse, to analyse the wider cultural context that Brand comes out of. In the 2000s, the kind of sort of after effect of 90s lad culture and the misogyny that was so culturally entrenched. But I think to focus too much on that would be to take away from the fact that this stuff is still happening. There are still people working in comedy who are the subject of open secrets. There are still people who work in comedy that we can't name because, again, of the threat of lawsuits. And there are still people working comedy who people will say oh, we don't send young women into their dressing rooms. Now, at that stage for me, that you should be sacked from that job.
Absolutely.
When you watch the Dispatches documentary and they talk about Brand's conduct in 2005 when he was presenting the add-on show for the reality TV show Big Brother, all of that conduct should be, at the very least, a sackable offence. If you can't have someone be around young women, they have no place in any kind of workplace. And the tolerance of it is something that we are going to have to actually have a reckoning with. There has to be accountability for Russell Brand, but there also has to be accountability for the decision makers who facilitated Russell Brand. For example, one of the accusers called a talent agency to tell them about this accusation, and they responded by sending a letter from his lawyers. That was the response. I don't know who that came from, but she contacted the talent agency and got a response from Russell Brand's lawyers, right? If you don't hold decision makers accountable, we will continue to perpetuate this culture of abuse. And that's something that I think cuts across every industry. There's clearly a specific problem that comes from this idea that the talent, which is this awful word that people use to describe presenters, which is a complete misnomer. At the end of the day, you're reading from a goddamn auto cue. You're not a genius. We should be eminently replaceable. And that there is clearly a specific problem that comes from indulging these kind of people that are perceived to be kind of great men. That's clearly an issue. But the thing that cuts across all of the industries is there is never a moment where systems are interrogated. We have a tendency to prosecute the individual and allow the system to go unconsidered. I guess my question is, why did people feel like they weren't able to report the abuse? Or if they did report the abuse, why were those complaints not taken seriously? We've either got a situation where the processes themselves are inadequate, or people just feel like they can't use them. Why are we relying on people being brave? That's the question. Because the only people, and I really mean this, the only people that come out of this with any credibility are the victims who have been brave enough to step forward and the journalists who have worked extremely hard to produce rigorous pieces of journalism so that they could get around the threats of a very powerful man's lawyers. And until we start asking ourselves the hard questions, we're never, ever, ever going to progress out of this. Until men start asking the hard questions about how we conduct ourselves, until people in powerful positions start asking questions about why they're indulging the whims of predators and monsters, until any of that happens, nothing is going to change.
No, absolutely. I mean, you use the word systemic failure there, and this account is just numerous systemic failures over and over again. It shouldn't be left to the fourth estate to be doing this, to be fighting for justice for these women. It should not be the job of press to be doing this. That tells you that something has gone very, very wrong, not only with policing, but also in kind of workplace protections, also just in terms of the support we give victims of sexual violence, in terms of, being believed on a kind of personal level. It's all gone horribly wrong because we live in a culture where, women are routinely dehumanized, where they're not believed. It's propped up by a legal system that never prosecutes criminals. My God, we have so much work to do because 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted. That's the stats. That's the facts. In fact, I had a little look this morning on Rape Crisis website. They said in the last year that 798,000 women were sexually assaulted. So that's 1 in 30. So if you know 30 women, one of them statistically has been raped or sexually assaulted in the last 12 months. This is not a legacy problem. I completely agree with you. But perpetrators, what is going on to victimize that many people? It requires a lot of perpetrators. I just think we just need to do so much better with our education around consent. It is genuinely urgent.